Hey, everybody. All right, get yourselves comfortable and
Thank you.
you want some water?
Sure.
All right, so good afternoon. How's everybody doing out there? Hope you're enjoying this as much as I am. Every customer deserves a great experience. I think we can all agree on that, right?
Hopefully.
Exactly.
But as we gather more data about our customers, the sources can be fragmented, and pulling that amount of information together to build a coherent customer story can be pretty difficult. So today we're going to discuss how this can all come together to help achieve the ultimate goal of delivering a meaningful experience for the customer, however you happen to define that. And I know you all define it differently. And just the makeup of our panel shows how broad this subject really is. So welcome to you all. So we're going to start off with you, Amit.
Great.
You know, the browsers are suddenly making it more difficult to track users, right? So I'm wondering what impact this will have on your customers' ability to gather data moving forward, and their ability to understand their customers better.
Yeah. No, it's a question that comes up a lot, and I would actually say it's it's broader than just browsers, right?
Right.
If you look around the whole landscape, I think clearly privacy is at the center of so much discussion, as it should be. So whether it's GDPR, whether it's laws being passed in California, whether it's tracking that Apple's implementing in Safari, there's a whole bunch of changes always happening. So I think there's kind of two aspects of it. Number one, from the Adobe point of view, privacy is first and foremost, right? So everything we do through a brand is all about how do you put privacy front and center. And to some extent, you're right, that will impact whatever data they collect, but they have to do it in a way that every consumer knows exactly what's being collected and they understand all the implications of what's happening there. But I think more broadly, yes, there's limitation of scope, but if you think about it more broadly, I mean, the amount of data signals coming out in general is exploding.
Sure.
Right. So yes, if you look at this browser implementation or if you look at that, but if you just look at the world we're living in and all the signals that our customers are exhibiting, whether that's through now an Alexa home device, whether that's through your Tesla car, whether that's you walk in a store, whether that's through a mobile app, I mean, it could go on and on.
Right.
Just the sheer amount of that continues to explode. Right. And so I think the challenge of what we're trying to solve, and I think a lot of us on stage are trying to solve, is how do you bring all that data together? Again, privacy central first, but how do you bring that data together so their brand can create the best experience?
So, and I'll get to you guys. It's not going to just be a
This is
conversation.
just me and him.
This is just the two of
That's
us.
fine.
You guys
Take it
can
out.
just leave. But how do you do that? Because I mean, I don't know. You guys have probably been to Europe. You open the browser. It says, you have this. And if you're like me and you open 25 browser tabs,
Yeah.
every time you open a site, you get that GDPR warning.
Yeah.
And it's just like you glaze over after a while.
Yep.
You don't really think about it. So, I mean, in a small sample, somebody who doesn't do a lot of,
Yep.
searching or surfing, as we used to call it, how do you kind of deliver that message that they have rights, and that they should be using those?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Again, it comes back to what I said a little bit earlier. I think you have to deliver it in a way that consumers understand, put it front and center, and it's a lot about education, right? So a lot of times, I think to your point, I think sometimes consent's hidden, sometimes people don't understand what it means, people browse, they glaze over. I think there's a huge opportunity, and we're seeing a lot of it happening now, where people are saying, hey, this is what it means, put it more front and center, and make it very, very clear. Right, and I think if you do that, and if we do it in the right way, the consumers come along for the ride. I think everybody wins.
Right.
Yeah.
So Julie, your company looks at this from a little bit of a different angle. Instead of collecting the information from external sources, you go right to the user, right?
Right. We do a little bit of both.
Yeah. So how are they using that information that they gather with Qualtrics tools to kind of improve that experience? That's kind of the goal of all this information gathering.
Right. The way that we think about it is we define the category as experience management. So if you're here earlier and you saw Bill talk, it's really about understanding all the things that your company does to create an experience for customers. And that really starts with employees and the culture you create, the kind of things that how they feel about what they're doing and what their goals are about being customer obsessed, or whatever your cultural goals are, show up in the products and services that you create. And then the customer experience is ultimately the collection of employee, product, brand awareness, how they feel about your brand, and then customers. And that can come from the information to understand those things can come from explicit surveys that you do for people where you ask them questions. It can come from social media. It can come from anywhere that you can glean, how people feel and what behavioral signs you can take in. And then we do analytics on top of that to help you understand the drivers between things, and then ultimately what to do to improve.
So again, as somebody who's like on their computer almost, all day long, and I'll get those kind of signals like, do you want to answer a survey? And usually my answer is no.
Right.
But you obviously need that information, and some people must respond. So how do you kind of motivate them to do that?
Sure. It depends on what's in it for you as a customer. And I think what we've the value exchange has changed over time. So giving you a 5 or 15 or 20 question survey is not really the way that people are going to take that time and do that.
Right.
But making it easier and simpler as you're browsing, for example, being able to take a quick, did you like this or did you like that, a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Those are all surveys. And so reinventing the notion of survey to be much broader about getting input that helps you with what you're trying to get done, not just helps the company with what they're trying to get done. And then creating that relationship with you and having it personalized to the way that you like to be contacted or the way you like it to suggest to the system how that can be a better experience for you.
I know personally, like either I usually respond if I'm really mad or I was really happy with the experience.
Right.
One or the other. If I'm in the middle, I'm just
Well, and that's why getting it from different sources. So what you say after a good or a bad customer experience, like right after the transaction, might be better or worse than what you tweet later, or what you tell other people on social media. So being able to capture all aspects of, in the moment, post, or even like what's your intent before you go in there. And then Bill talked a little bit about the operational data side of it, of not just looking at how do people feel, because that can be an indicator of future success if people like your products and are interested in what you're doing. But you also have to look at the more lagging indicators, the operational metrics around, did they buy? Did they enjoy it? Did they come back? Are they repeating? Are the employees more engaged? Did your engaged, happy employees really result in happier customers?
Right. So Peter, I know your products kind of help pull the data together. You kind of have the data pipes, right?
Yep.
So, what is exactly the goal of all this data gathering that you're helping your customers do? What are you trying to help them achieve?
Yeah, so at a high level, what our customers are trying to achieve is either drive analytics or better marketing automation or better marketing campaigns. But if you think about sort of why they even need this data piping in the first place, look at a company like Dollar Shave Club, for example. Very sort of simple business unit, simple set of SKUs, simple product, growing like a weed in that sort of one dimension. If you think about an enterprise, like many of you, it's very complicated. You've got many different business units. We have one sort of multinational CPG customer that I was visiting last week in the Midwest, and they've got hundreds of brands. They've got half a dozen CEOs, half a dozen presidents, a bunch of business units underneath that. So managing all the customer experience across all these different business units, all these different brands, all the different matrixing of how those things fit together, incredibly complicated and not the sort of infrastructure that you want to maintain internally to break down the data silos that then allow you to deliver a good customer experience on top of that.
Yeah.
So Segment comes in to help stitch all that together.
How does that work? I mean, how can you take something that complex and pull it together in a way that makes sense at all?
So for a small startup, they implement Segment to collect data on their website, their mobile apps, their servers, their payment system, their CRM, et cetera. And they usually do that in a couple days. In the enterprise, it does take a little while.
Right.
But they can roll it out across all those brands, one website, one mobile app at a time.
So, it's all well and good to have all this data. I mean, the idea is, as you mentioned, is to get it into the hands of the business user and, let them use it. But how do they make sense of that data when there's just so much of it? Do you want to start?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. Well, I think Peter said it really well. So I think a couple things. Number one, you're absolutely right that we talked about the amount of signals, the amount of data is exploding, and I think there's multiple use cases to use that data, right? So there's a use case around analytics and reporting, and how do I make sense of this, and how do I use it for, to go optimize business processes or all that. And then there's clearly activation. Hey, I want to be able to take this and automatically change an experience, right? Whether it's an email campaign or an advertising campaign or whatever it might be, use it automatically and deploy that to the touch point of some type of customer experience. I think the key point, which you're probably alluding to a little bit, or at least the way we look at it, is the systems that got us here won't be the ones that get you the future, in the sense that the sheer amount of this volume of data, anything that was done manually is just not going to work. Right. And so I think, we talk, a lot of people say AI, ML, like it's a buzzword, but the reality is it's true, right? You need to be able to take this data in, you need to be able to apply modeling and predictive thinking to it, and then using that intelligence, then go apply it. It's the only way you're going to make sense of the sheer amount of data and actually be able to drive these optimal experiences. That's my thoughts.
No, I totally agree. I think one of the other things is when you can use AI or ML to go and figure out what's really going on in the system, it also helps you really understand the data in a way that you can't do it by manually reading it.
Correct.
So for, say, employee experience data, you've probably all taken those surveys where you fill out how you feel about working for your company, and there's a verbatim section where you can type in comments on your manager or anything else. So, the olden days, what did you do as a leader? You got back all the answers, you looked at the scale, and then you immediately, text search for your name and all those comments to find out what people are saying about you. And that clouded your judgment about what you were really seeing. And so with the tools, with the analytics, as they're understanding the text and sorting and gathering and filtering and correlating and collating and let you know what really is going on and what the drivers are. And so your own biases are kind of taken out of it, and you can really understand what the drivers are for engagement, customers, employees, or whatever. And so it's really important that you have tools and you can have real-time measurement too. So it's not a static measurement that doesn't change very often. Something like NPS, you can really find out what's happening on a very quick turn basis, and you need tools for that.
I have a slightly different perspective maybe than sort of AI/ML, which is that for most of our customers, the tricky part is actually getting the data ready for AI/ML.
Yeah.
And I was actually at a business review with one of our Fortune 500 media customers a couple months ago, and they've been wanting to do AI machine learning for a long time, but data was never in that format. We're rolling out sort of a new feature that puts data directly into Parquet files, which then becomes something that machine learning team can just run with without a lot of data munging. And that was, for them, a huge breakthrough, that they would actually have all the data in a format that they could use. It was clean and consistent. Like, that is where 90% of the work comes in, and I think that's where we see most enterprises struggling today.
And the other place I think people struggle is on the hypothesis of what they actually want to learn. It's like, so when you talk about using ML, it's not that you just dump a bunch of data in and see what happens. You actually kind of have to have a hypothesis about what you want the outcome to be and what you think you're driving towards, and then you can check against whether you're really doing what you think you're doing, and closing those experience gaps where you may find things you didn't anticipate, but more often than not, you're measuring something you're already looking for.
It is just to build on Peter's point real quick. We did I wouldn't call it a survey, but we met with a lot of companies, and this question of, hey, what's that? It wasn't a survey. But to exactly your point, it is true that if you go and talk to these really, really expensive data scientists and PhDs and algorithms who, we recruit out of Stanford and MIT, and these guys are geniuses. I mean, truly, they're geniuses. And you go ask them how much of your time, exactly your point, is spent on just getting the data ready, it's 80 to 90%.
Yeah.
Right.
So you're actually, I completely agree with your point. Before you're going to do that, there's a whole, call it data wrangling, calling it data stitching, whatever you want to call it. But I agree, it's a huge challenge. And we're paying very, very smart people, right? They're not actually able to do what you're paying them to do. And so that's a huge unlock.
Right.
We want to.
My favorite quip is that they spend 80% of their time munging the data and 20% of their time complaining about it.
That's right. That's right.
That's totally true,
Sounds
especially when
about
you're getting it from different sources and it's not coming in all normalized. Yeah.
Yep.
So in terms of, let's dig into that a little bit, though. In terms of, obviously, I think we can all agree that AI and ML can help the data glut problem, but how? How does it do that? So how is it going to help people, understand the data and get to that point where some of that automation is happening and things are becoming clearer for people in terms of, what they're seeing?
Do you want to start?
Okay. I'm happy.
I think it's the same thing. It's that 80% of time that people are dedicating to just trying to organize it right
But not
now.
just, I'm not talking about just the data scientists here. I'm talking about like the end users. When you get back down to the end user and you get beyond the data scientists and how the AI and ML is actually helping them, by having that underlying technology.
Go ahead.
I'm happy to give my 2 cents.
Sure,
Let's make it really tangible. right? So let's take an end user who, again, I'm familiar with my world, who might be in charge of email campaigns, right? And let's say this end user is sitting there saying, okay, I have this, my job is to get more people to click on my emails, right? And I want all my consumers clicking on them. Without AI/ML, their world is, okay, I got to go create and figure out, I'll do some lightweight A/B testing, but I'll figure out what to put in the subject line, right? And it takes a long time for them to get tests back and to figure out, and then, hey, I'm going to put some rules around it if this user came here, and then what do I put in that subject line? I think that to make it very practical, what that user can now do is, ideally, whatever system they're using has built-in AI/ML capabilities to say, hey, we've actually been looking at the data for you, right? We've been looking at how people respond. We've been matching that to a whole bunch of independent variables. And based on that, we recommend these subject lines, right? So it completely changes the efficiency and productivity and ideally the ROI of what they're doing. That's just one example. But that's how you make AI/ML usable to that practitioner. Right, and make it practical, right? Is how do you give these services that you don't have to be the data scientist, right? But you can be anyone. Everyone's trying to figure out how to go optimize something in their job. So how do I use the AI/ML, build it into the capabilities, the workflow that you're used to, and then effectively make you do your job better? That's one idea.
Right. So like the text analytics I was talking about before, you read in the text, and the system understands and sorts and collates the content, and then comes back and tells you these are the drivers for customer engagement in these areas. These are the topics that came up during it. Would you like to sort and filter? And then you can compare segments of users against topics that they talked about, and then you can use the computing power to go and do that, so you're not doing it manually.
Sure. You talked a little bit about this at the top about privacy, and privacy is central here. We now have GDPR. We have the California Consumer Privacy Act coming online. I've been told there are dozens of such laws in some stage of proposal. All of your platforms were created pre-GDPR. So how do you comply with these privacy laws? And when the products weren't even created, when you had to think about that.
Well, think about privacy from the very beginning. With Qualtrics, thinking about gathering data from people, and you have to be respectful of what data they want used and what data they don't want used, what personally identifiable information is in there. So the system already was thinking about that. And then as these new things come in, HIPAA compliance, FedRAMP, GDPR, the list goes on, but you have a system that you can understand the data and prevent people from seeing things that they shouldn't see, or erase people if you need to erase people.
The one comment I would say is, and to your point, I raised at the beginning, I think if you take a huge step back, so first of all, I think GDPR, all these things are goodness. I actually look at it as how do we bring consumers in the right way along on this journey, right? And I'm all about how do you give more visibility, more consent, more education. We talked about that. That's one side. If you actually look at the brand and enterprise side, they are struggling. Right? They're sitting there saying, oh my God, I got GDPR coming. I've got all these different systems. I've got California. So they're looking at it from a point of view of just, hey, help me. So it's actually interesting because everyone tends to look at it, I think a little bit the way you're framing it too. It's like, hey, there's a massive headwind. There's actually a huge tailwind here, right? And I think there's a huge opportunity to be a brand, which again, I think we're trying to do, and go to these customers and say, hey, let us help you with this, right? And our principles are aligned. Right, our principles are aligned on how do we make sure the consumer has the right experience, that they feel they're trusted, that you know them, but do it in the right way. And how do we, that's our responsibility, to build and navigate the systems in a way that it helps you, do all these things in the right way. So that's kind of our lens on it. And I think there's a huge amount of opportunity if we do this the right way.
Well, I'm thinking about XM, and you're thinking about, today, all the data that you're gathering is in different silos inside the company. So the sales team has the customer data, the marketing team has the brand data, the HR person has the employee data. And so even inside the company, if you can collate that all together, there still has to be who has access to that data, who can see the private employee data as well as the sensitive sales data. And so that's what the CXO, my role at Qualtrics, is that role, to be able to be in the C-suite and get access to that kind of data for our company, and be able to make sure that all the things are going right and we're paying attention to all the privacy and security rules around that.
There are a lot of CIOs and CTOs who I think see GDPR and CCPA as just sort of another thing that dropped in their lap. It's like, oh man, we got to deal with this now. But in reality, I was talking to a CIO last week, and he actually had a very clever perspective on this, which was he said, this is one of the, never waste a crisis.
Right.
And this is a huge opportunity for us actually to go drive a digital transformation.
Yep.
We've always wanted to go back and clean up all of our first-party data infrastructure. We've always wanted to go back and put in place good tools and build the right pipes to handle all this stuff. And we've never had the political willpower necessarily internally to go get it done. And so now all of a sudden there's willpower from the board on down to actually go build this correctly because it's required. And so in his eyes, and I think this is genius, never waste a good crisis. Let's go get it all done. Let's go do the digital transformation. Let's go put in place best-in-class tools. And let's make these pipelines not only GDPR and CCPA compliant, but sing for all the business purposes that we've always wanted.
And then data's cleaner, more performant. There's all kinds of benefits
All kinds of
from
benefits.
that. Mm-hmm.
So I think you can see it as an opportunity.
The more acronyms, the more budget he gets.
Exactly.
So we talked about privacy. Let's talk about security. So we're talking about a lot of data here, right? I mean, and if somebody were to get a hold of it, it could get pretty ugly pretty quickly. So what's your plan if data leaks, when data leaks, to plug that up and do what you can?
Well, you guys want to go first?
You guys don't want to take
I think security obviously is something that all of us are facing, right? The sort of attackers out there are getting more sophisticated. They're always on the prowl. I think the question is how you respond when it happens, how you deal with it quickly, how it matures you as a company, how you take it down and ensure that you're constantly getting better in that access. And so I think that's our philosophy.
And I think
I think everyone, I think at Segment, and I assume both of you, when you store as much customer data as we do, it's something we take super, super seriously.
Yeah. And I think it's also about transparency. When something like when something like that happens, it's exactly, Peter, how do you handle it? Right. And are you transparent about what happened? Are you transparent about the implications?
You tell customers.
You tell, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's where you can.
So, I mean, we probably have a bunch of startup founders out here. So I'm wondering if you were advising these startups about how to protect data, what would you tell them, as they build the product from scratch?
I mean,
think about it from the beginning.
Yeah, think about it from the beginning.
Prepare.
Again, I don't think that's anything new, but I agree. I mean, security, privacy, all these things are critically important. So from the very beginning, architect your systems, think about what that means, think about where it's going. Right, and I love the way Peter said it, the mentality around how you think about it, right? Make sure you bring in people that think that way, right? It's all about transparency and treating people the right way.
Test your hypothesis.
Yep.
Look for angles on it.
Anything, Peter, that you would advise?
I mean, for startups that are just getting started, you can get surprisingly far, I think, with encrypting your databases, getting permissions right, and multi-factor auth and SSO, to name a few.
Exactly.
So we got about 2 minutes left, so I want to ask one more question of you guys. We've all dealt with horrible customer experience, right? We all can tell horror stories about when things didn't go well. And I've had this kind of thesis that, we have all this data, right? And it's all sitting in databases, but it doesn't do any good if the person on the ground who's dealing with the customer in person doesn't do anything with it. How do you get all that information to the right person so that when they're dealing with the customer, they understand how to do it correctly and not kind of blow the whole brand?
This is actually the biggest failure mode that I think we see when we come in to sort of help a company stand up good customer data infrastructure, is that they previously had a data lake project of some sort. Yeah. And so there's a big technology team that's been assembled to put all of the data into a data lake. Maybe it's a Hadoop cluster or whatever. And all the data's in there, everyone's thumbs up. And then there's this moment of silence where everyone is like,
now what?
And now the business people are going to write Java queries. That's not what happens, right? So I think, to your point, often the data does get into one of these clusters, and then the question is, how are you actually going to activate it into these downstream systems? That's the problem that we try to solve, but I think there's a number of approaches to it.
I agree with all that, but I would take a maybe even simpler approach to it's about the culture you create.
Right.
And whether the people in your company think the way you want them to about how important the customer experience is, if they are gold or valued. The values and the way you treat your employees informs how they're going to treat customers. And so, you look at somebody like Disney, they don't even call their employees employees. their cast members. And so that feeling that you give them of you're a cast member in a show and in an event and in an experience informs how they act and react. And then the data and being able to personalize it for the individual that's having the experience, that only makes that better. But you have to start with what your values are.
Right. So we're just out of time, so we're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid.
They said it better than I can.
All right, let's thank the panel, please. Hi, everybody. Thanks, guys.